I mean, take a stab at it. Realistically, when are we going to be back to where we were before March of 2020?
The latest recommendation or latest predictions right now coming out from public health experts is looking like late spring, early summer of 2021, when we start to reach a pretty high level of vaccination and can start to make some different public health mitigation strategy decisions.
This is the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast. I'm James Tully. The voice you just heard was Dr. Jason Wilson. He's from Tampa General Hospital, and he's been answering questions about COVID-19 and the virus since the whole pandemic started. He's been on the air with us on ABC Action News, and he certainly has provided a lot of great information. So today, we went long. It's about an hour-long conversation. I kept all of it in because he answered a lot of questions that I had about the virus, and maybe you had them too, like, why are there so many asymptomatic cases? What do we still not know about this virus? Who is really at risk? Should you be scared of it if you are under the age of 40, for example? And then he goes into a very good explanation about how the vaccine will be distributed, why he feels it's very safe to take, and why he feels it's a modern medical miracle that we got it so quickly. So again, this went a little bit longer than my podcasts here usually do, but I think you'll find this really informative. So let's get to it. I've got Dr. Jason Wilson here from Tampa General Hospital. He is the medical director of the Clinical Decision Unit. Dr. Wilson, do you want to put that in layman's terms for us with exactly what that means and what you do?
So I'm an emergency medicine physician, so I see COVID patients, but I also have some administrative functions as well. I help run the emergency department and run an observation space, a place where we can keep patients and make sure they're safe to go home or if they need to be admitted to the hospital.
I have a lot of questions about this virus, and I feel like this many months in, there's a lot of things just being said, but it's great to have someone of your stature on the podcast to kind of put some things into perspective and bring some clarity to a few things. We've got the holidays coming up here, and some people will want to travel. I want to touch on that and what your recommendations are, but I want to start with COVID-19 itself. At this point, I know there's a lot we still don't know about the virus. Can we get into that a little bit? What are some things that this far in we still really don't know about the virus itself?
Yeah, definitely. So if you think of this as really an ongoing process that goes back to last January or late December, almost a year now, we've learned quite a bit, and there's still a lot of unknowns. One of the most important things we've learned a lot about with this virus is the actual genetic structure of the virus, because that's allowed us to make a vaccine and to target treatment to the virus. And so one of the big decisions that was made early on was to sequence the genome of the virus. That allowed for people to start working right then on creating a new type of technology vaccine called an mRNA vaccine. And that type of vaccine basically makes use of that genetic sequence of the virus and makes proteins that can help attack that virus when it's in the body. And specifically what we've learned is that the virus has this little protein on the outside of it called the spike protein. And that spike protein is really responsible for a lot of destruction, a lot of devastation in our bodies. That protein is what allows the virus to get inside the cells and replicate. And so what we've seen now is that these vaccines we're hearing about are going to create the spike protein using mRNA in our bodies. That's a new type of technology we've never really seen before go live. Very cool. All that mRNA technology will do is create spike protein, and then we can make antibodies against that. Now, we've had some other treatment modalities too. We've seen these monoclonal antibodies that have an emergency use authorization from the FDA. Those also target that spike protein. Remdesivir tries to keep that spike protein from binding to the cell so that it can't get inside and replicate. So we're really starting to see a lot of targeted therapy around what the virus looks like. So that's the known.
My understanding is what the vaccine's going to do is basically arm our bodies with these spiked proteins that will battle then the same spike that the molecule in the virus has. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
One more step in the middle there. So the body will be armed with these spike proteins, and then we'll see those spike proteins and create antibody against those spike proteins. Gotcha. That antibody will then go out and battle
the real
spike protein that's attached to the virus, right? which is also important to note that these vaccines are going to be pretty safe vaccines, right? Because all that's going to happen, there's no viral particles. This is just technology that is an instruction booklet for your body to create its own version of that spike protein. So we're not giving anybody any type of attenuated virus. We're just giving people mRNA instruction
Okay,
booklets,
that
and then it's
that
up to
puts it in a
yourselves to
very
fill that.
interesting way. I had never thought about that before. Let me put it bluntly to you. At this point, should everyone be afraid of this virus?
Oh, so we certainly know that any age group that can get this virus can have unpredictable response. So while it is true that people with comorbidities, other medical problems, are much more likely to have a worse outcome, we've been surprised by some of the younger patients that we've seen, or some patients we just can't explain why they got so sick. Sometimes the inflammatory cascade runs away and we can't get a hold of it, and those people get very sick. And not only that, the other problem is that even healthy people, when they get this virus, we know that the less symptomatic they are, the more people they transmit virus to, furthering this whole pandemic, spreading the virus around to others, and likely getting other people very sick.
Is the reason that asymptomatic patients spread it more because they don't realize they have it and they're around more people, or is the virus presenting itself differently in asymptomatic patients?
So yes, I think is the right answer to that question. So there's a lot of ways to unpack that. So first of all, it is likely true that people who are younger are less likely to have significant symptoms from this virus. The younger and healthy you are, the less symptoms you're going to have. In addition, we just know that younger, healthier people are also the ones who are going to be out doing things more often. They're going to be the ones who want to go to crowded bars, nightclubs, restaurants, or go back home. Many colleges have, essentially shut down campuses after November 30th. So they're the ones who are going to be traveling and going back home earlier, potentially spreading virus with them. Now, having said that, there do seem to be what we call phenotypic differences in how people present with the virus. Phenotypic difference means just sort of you have the same virus, but for some reason it just acts different for you. And that's part of that unknown. We don't know exactly why some people have the responses they have to the virus and others don't. It probably has something to do with their internal makeup in terms of their own inflammatory response to any type of pathogen, including COVID-19.
So I guess that would basically mean that there really isn't a medical explanation for why there are asymptomatic cases. I mean, can we explain that? Is it because our bodies, people who are asymptomatic, they've fought off viruses before, maybe similar ones or other ones, and their response is different? Or do we just not have a way to explain the asymptomatic?
Yeah, overall, the easiest way to explain it is by saying the patient's just healthier and they have less comorbidities. The more other medical problems that you have, just the less reserve you have, the less ability you have to sort of for your body to kind of ignore or just not be affected by the fact that it's also fighting a war. Think about it like if you're a country and you're fighting one war at a time, you can put all your forces into that war, all your military spending there. If you're fighting 7 wars at once, though, all of a sudden each war probably affects you pretty hard. And so if you have diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, right, you're fighting lots and lots of battles every day with a pretty compromised system. Versus if you're a healthy young person, this is one battle your body's fighting. Now, having said that, sometimes what we learn is that there's some surprise attacks there, right? And the attack against even healthy people is not benign. And so we've seen very, very healthy people get very sick unpredictably. Another thing, too, that we don't really know yet is what's going to happen to healthy people who've had virus later on. And I think there's a lot of interest around there because one thing that we are learning more and more about now, 9, 10 months into this, is this long hauler syndrome. Patients who are still short of breath, having chest pain, not fully back to work, feeling fatigue, feeling foggy, feeling different, who are healthy people before this virus. But just haven't been able to return back to their normal lives yet.
Yeah, that might be one of the more disturbing parts about it. And you're right, long-term effects of this, it's just that we haven't had a long enough term go by, right, where we can actually analyze that and say that this is a normal symptom or a long-term symptom of having contracted COVID-19.
That's right. Only time will tell. I mean, there's There's chickenpox viruses that represent themselves in old age as shingles, right? I mean, that takes, sometimes 50,
Right.
60 years to
Right.
reprevent. So how do we know all of these things about this virus? Now, we do have experience with other coronaviruses, which is helpful. And, there's certain viral properties about a coronavirus in general that we can make some predictions about. There are, 4 or 5 other coronaviruses out there. But I always caution people that we just don't know all the impacts later on and downstream of this virus right
Well,
now.
forgive the simplicity of this question, but what has made this so bad?
Yeah, this virus in general, I think, has been so bad because A, it's got some unpredictability to it. B, it's easily spreads, right? And so maybe it didn't, fortunately, it's not spreading by fomites or contact surfaces as much as we were worried about back in March. But nonetheless, it's a respiratory virus. And so in close contact, this thing does spread quite a bit. And then the big thing is that the response that your body has to this virus because of the virus particle itself, really leads to a pretty big inflammatory cascade, which is kind of like a train wreck. And your body's defense system goes into overdrive. And this is, and in addition, the virus is able to adhere itself to all kinds of different cells in the body because it doesn't just attack lung cells, it attacks the actual, what we call endothelial cells, a certain type of cell within the blood vessels. Well, you have blood vessels everywhere. So that means the virus can essentially attack any organ system. And so we've got patients who, have oxygenation problems, problems breathing. But once that happens, because that inflammatory cascade, that overwhelming inflammatory response, those breathing problems can turn into kidney problems, blood pressure problems, all types of issues for patients.
Let's talk about fatality risks here. Young, healthy people. My age group would be, you're 25 to 35, maybe 50 and under, whatever else. What are we talking about there with that? I mean, have you seen death in healthy people under the age of, say, 40 years old?
Yeah, so overall, right now, we've done a much better job with containing fatality with this virus than, say, we were doing in March and April. Fatality was very high in April. We have many more cases now of the virus than we did going back to April and May, but the fatality numbers looked about the same. So that means we've done something right in some sense. And what is right that we've done is the supportive care aspects of this virus we've really improved upon. You've got hospitals who've been working with patients who have COVID now for 8 months. So this has become like treating heart attacks or strokes. You've got care teams that really understand how to approach the patient with COVID. An example of this, early on, we were using a lot of intubation, meaning putting tubes in people's mouth to help them breathe, which required a ventilator and resources. Now we realize that a lot of those patients do just fine on what we call high flow nasal canal oxygen, two big prongs in the nose with heated temperature humidified oxygen. So that avoids having to have a respiratory therapist and a ventilator, and we haven't seen any worsening of fatality. A lot of things when we think about viruses, and a lot of the conversation we're having right now is about what are the unknowns and should we be scared of this and why is this virus so deadly. Part of that is it comes down to the ability for our society to both prevent transmission but also be able to respond to each person with individualized care when they do get sick. Now, what happened in Italy and New York and early on this virus was that the overwhelming surge and the high level of resources that were put into each patient meant that they couldn't keep up. And that surge meant that you might have a psychiatrist trying to intubate a patient, which, is appreciate the help, but that's a difficult thing for them to do. It'd be like me trying to see a patient with depression, the outpatient setting, probably not the doctor you want doing that. And so we saw the case fatality rates go up quite a bit. Now, as we're able to manage transmission, this is the whole idea of that flattening the curve concept, which we could certainly still improve on. We have not done a great job with that. But in this area, the mask mandate really helped us start to try to turn the curve around. The bar closures in the summer helped us turn the curve around, and we were able to kind of get control of our hospital systems again. And we got control of our hospital systems. We could enact interdisciplinary healthcare teams who could take care of each patient individually and keep that case fatality rate pretty low overall.
That all sounds pretty good. In terms of how the media is reporting this, I'll bluntly ask you. I took issue early on with just putting big numbers up on the screen of total cases, total death. I think it deserves I think our viewers and people watching deserve some perspective on this, and I think they had to make the call for themselves as to how concerned they needed to be depending on what area they were in. So we went into breaking it down county by county. We started going into the percent positivity rate, the number of tests being given, number of hospitalizations in a given area. I thought that was all really important because if you're talking about a situation where you have 2,000 or 3,000 new cases a day, but we have a state that's 21, 22 million people in it, it requires perspective as to how serious this is and how much you should be concerned. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. So a couple of things on that piece. First of all, viewers and listeners should understand that anytime we've seen a rise in the number of cases, what has followed that is a rise in the number of hospitalizations. I think that's really important because we get into these conversations about, is it just more testing? Are these people actually sick? Are they just asymptomatic? But every time we've seen a rise in the number of cases, what's followed is a rise in the number of hospitalizations. So I think that's an important concept. The second thing that's important to understand too is kind of this public health idea of per capita, or the incidence rate, or prevalence per some number in the population. Because if I tell you there's 2,000 cases a day in Florida, it's kind of hard to get your mind around that. That sounds maybe really high, but that might be really good if there's compared to 10,000 cases. But what does that mean for the population? Right. 2,000 cases in Florida might be very good, but in Wyoming might be very bad, right? Because the population size is very different. So what a lot of us try to do when we talk to each other as public health experts is we try to make those numbers apples to apples comparisons. So maybe per 100,000 cases, which sounds like what you're doing in a county level as well. You try to break it down to a population people understand in the local area they live in, and then try to make some numbers from there. Because I do think people need that perspective. Otherwise, you kind of get lost in these numbers every day. The other important thing about numbers too is that I know there's a lot of debates about, testing and whether these people are sick or not. Are the numbers right? And is this dashboard the right dashboard or not? Trends really help with that, because sometimes when you look at trends over time, even if the numbers are off a little bit here or there, the trends, will wash some of that out. And right now, clearly, the trend in this country is that there is an overwhelmingly high surge in the number of new cases per day. The trend in this county, in this area, back in June and July, was that we went through a massive exponential surge. The trend right now in this specific area of Tampa Bay is that while cases are increasing, they're not quite as increasing as high as like the Midwest or South Dakota, and not quite as bad as they were in June and July, but they're certainly increasing day by day. So those trends over time, I think, are very helpful to look at as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what do you deduce from that? I mean, what exactly do you take from that, specifically in the Bay Area, that our cases are increasing, but not as much as other parts of the country? Because for all intents and purposes, Florida has had things back open longer than a lot of other states. And also, we've dropped some of the capacity requirements in restaurants and bars to some of the highest levels. We've raised the capacity limits to some of the highest levels in the country as well. I just took a trip back to Pennsylvania recently, and it's like a different country in the way that things are being handled and everything else. Florida appeared to me to be much more lax. So what do you take from the trends there when we talk about what our state has done?
Sure. So for one, I do think there's quite a bit of county by county variance right now. There's some heterogeneity there when you compare one county to the other. In Hillsborough County specifically, we have done a reasonable job of trying to enact some public health measures. We saw a clear change in around the end of June, June 26th, when we implemented the mask mandate here in this county. Clearly, the growth rate decreased after that. We rolled back the bar openings for a little while in the summer, and clearly got a hold of this virus again. Now, the other thing in Florida that's interesting is that if you compare Florida to places with more restrictive lockdowns and places with more or less cases, you're right. We do kind of look a little outlierish in there. So there's some hypotheses about that. One is that perhaps people are able to stay outside a little longer into this fall and as we go into the winter than other places. It is definitely true that the virus is much more likely to spread around
Indoors.
in
Yeah, that's
close
true. I
contact
didn't
indoor
I didn't think about our
spaces.
climate playing a role in that. You're right. We're gonna be
Yeah,
outside
so
much more than other states.
people like to be outside here. People are going to do a lot of their social activities. Are just going to be outside
Yeah.
anyway. Going to the beach. Going for a bike ride, eating in an outdoor restaurant. This does level and layer in a protective effect. And then some of the sporting events, of course, have still been protective as well. Raymond James stays at a pretty low capacity, and is also an outdoor stadium with a mask mandate inside. So I think these things have helped us. Now, having said that, this is a critical time. I will tell you that already we are seeing a surge in the number of people presenting who not only for testing, but also who are very concerning about the holidays, stating that they were exposed to somebody over a Thanksgiving holiday. And now they're presenting worried about that exposure and wanting testing. And so you start to kind of work that out and you realize that holiday gathering had 10, 15 people at it, right? And so there's going to be that number of people presenting somewhere, for testing, whether it's in Florida or somewhere else. So these, right now we're really nervous, I would say, about what's gonna come from that Thanksgiving holiday gathering, that we're already starting to see people present for testing because of known
Well, let's go to
exposure.
this then, because we're just a few weeks away from Christmas. And, let's lay it out like this. People want to be with their families during Christmas. If it's a state like Florida, a lot of people have either another home or they come and travel down here or they travel elsewhere. I think this has to be one of the top states when it comes to travel in and out of around the holidays. So can you justify any travel during the upcoming holiday or time spent with family from a medical perspective?
It would be very hard to. This is a time. This is going to be a strange 2020. I would recommend highly that you really look at not you basically only have a holiday event with your pod. Your pod meaning the people you already live with right now. If that would be the number one recommendation, period. And I know that's not a socially fun sounding recommendation, but just from a strictly medical standpoint, that would be the recommendation. Now, if you're going to not do that, right? In medicine, we always try to work with the patient to do what is they're actually going to do, right? We start with our best recommendation and kind of work from there. So if you're not going to do that, then an outdoor gathering is probably the next best thing. So before Thanksgiving, I really emphasized with the local community that, look, you live in Florida. I think it was 80 something degrees on Thanksgiving, right? Why not just have an outdoor event if you're going to do a Thanksgiving holiday, and with people other than your own pod. Now travel. Look, I mean, right now we have to highly recommend against travel at this point. We are so close to getting out of this. It is so possible, so realistic now that late spring, early summer, we see a dramatic turn in what we're having to do right now. As Americans, we are able to buckle down for a few more months and follow some public health strategies and get through this. There are people in other countries who wait years to be able to do a holiday, a gathering like we take advantage of every year. But how bad would it be if a family member were to get sick, be hospitalized, die alone in this winter right before in the darkest days before the dawn? Because look, this is not just talk anymore. Public health experts are now telling you that we are just months away, realistically months away from a vaccine that's going to really change what these recommendations look like. So this will be a weird story in 5 years, but you just you got to kind of make it through
Until the
this year.
vaccine is out and it's widely distributed and everything
Right.
else. That's what you're getting to. Well, on that topic, because you mentioned it's a weird year and the travel and everything else, we've been recommending to people, per the Florida Department of Health and the CDC, that if you do travel, the rapid test is something you should be doing 1 to 3 days before you travel, 3 to 5 days after, right? You want to allow that pad time if you were exposed for the test to be more accurate. Is that correct?
Yeah, a few important recommendations that have been revised by the CDC, recognizing that while our best medical advice would be not to travel, look, everybody recognizes there are situations where it is just needed. And so, if you're going to travel, a new revised recommendation of the CDC is to consider rapid testing, which is in a way great to even know that we have the ability to make that recommendation now, because that means that testing has become more widely available than the position we were in the summer, right? It would have been really hard for a public health body to say, go get rapid tested when there was nowhere to get rapidly tested at. Um, right? So that's a big change. And so now seeing the success of some of the major sports programs who have followed a little bit of that guideline, on their own, or created that guideline on their own, and some success, the NBA had this summer, it does seem to start to make sense that if you follow the incubation period of the virus closely, in a situation where you need to go somewhere, that would be the best strategy to do it. So still the recommendation would be probably to try not to travel, stay with your pod. But if you're going to do it, yes, rapid test before you travel, 3 days before you travel, and then about 3 days after you get to where you're going, recognizing that you may be in an incubation period of the virus, and that the test sensitivity is higher when the virus is actively shedding. So if you just got infected right after you got your test, you may not have a positive test yet. And so that recommendation is a newer CDC recommendation, I think an important one. So you'd want to look and see where you're traveling to see if there's a place, you can go. Here locally, you can make an appointment at TGH, fast track urgent care, and just go get a rapid test that way. But you want to kind of check out and see where you're going, make sure there's something like that available. I think the airport here is doing something similar as well.
You said we're in that really dark moment before the dawn. You said we're so close here. One of my least favorite words of the year is social distancing. I'm tired of saying it. I just simply don't like it. But I understand the importance of it. But gotta ask you, I mean, realistically here, when are we going to be in a situation where we don't have to wear masks? When are we going to be in a situation where we can stop using the term social distancing? And, it's seemingly we've turned a lot of people into germaphobes with this. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, because I believe that there's a really good chance that we could see a drop in a lot of those types of viruses and diseases because people are more conscious of washing hands and living cleaner and everything else. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's difficult when you have a family member or a loved one who you see has really been changed by this. And I know I'm speaking more emotionally than medically right now, but take a stab at it. Realistically, when are we going to be back to where we were before March of 2020?
Sure. And in some parts of, and I think you're hinting at this, some parts of what we're doing right now are going to stick with us. They're going to stay.
Like what?
I think our recognition that large crowds, have the potential to spread virus very quickly is just going to be part of planning and a part of understanding of organizers and public health experts in a way it just wasn't before. Attention to, these types of viruses early is going to be something that just wasn't there before. Whether we maybe, if you go back to 2009 with the H1N1 epidemic here, in this area, would we have masked then, knowing what we know now? Maybe. Right? If we would have known how effective masking was, maybe we would have masked in 2009 too and prevented a lot of deaths that way. So maybe we see that, the turning on the key of putting masks back on, is a little bit, easier to turn now, right? Than it was before. Even just having that in our armamentarium of public health strategies to utilize safe at home, social distancing, decreased capacity type of measures, which we just didn't really see before, right? That's been at least 100 years probably since those types of measures were enacted. And, I think we learned a lot from this, right? We probably, in Tampa, we closed down everything basically for a little while. Did we really need to close down parks? Probably not, knowing what we know now, but we didn't know that then. And it sounds silly, this is true. People have been trying to get doctors to wash their hands consistently for 20 years now, recognizing this is a big cause of infections in the hospital. And it's really, I would really say up until this, it's probably not fully caught on. I think you'll look at those hand washing campaigns now and you'll have huge compliance. I think it'll become natural culture at this point. That'll be a big shift. I think for most people, I think that'll be a big shift to, really pay attention to those types of behaviors. So we're going to be wearing masks for still a little while because one thing is even with these vaccines coming, it's going to take a little while for everybody, A, to get vaccinated, and B, for us to make sure that the vaccine efficacy is there for asymptomatic spread. So we still don't have data for that based on the available data. The data we have right now for the vaccines is a decrease people getting sick from COVID, not necessarily decreasing COVID cases. So until we get everybody who's vulnerable vaccinated, we're still going to probably see mask wearing until that vaccine is more widespread. And the latest recommendation or latest predictions right now coming out from public health experts is looking like late spring, early summer of 2021 when we start to reach a pretty high level of vaccination and can start to make some different public health mitigation strategy decisions.
Right. So that would be the elimination of your social distancing. Or I should say a relaxing of it maybe in some areas when we're not.
Yeah. Yeah, a consideration at least of, well, what you have to see first, hopefully the indicators, the leading indicators start to come down, right? And you go back, you mentioned this earlier, positivity rates and, different positivity rates have been thrown around. There's no perfect positivity rate to pick. New York City was using 3% for a while, and I think they've stopped. 5%.
We use 5% down here. Right.
And, the idea behind that is basically you got to have it low enough so that if you want to turn on a public health measure, it can actually work. Like, if my positivity rate's 20%, which it was for a while, if my positivity rate's, 20%.
And that, for the people listening, by the way, that is the number of people getting tested who are positive. That's when we say positivity rate, that's what we're talking about in a given area. We talk statewide in Florida. I don't know, Dr. Wilson, I'll just throw out a number. 20,000 people are tested in a day. The number coming back positive, that's the positive rate that we're trying to project out and present to the public. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, right. If I have my hospital test 100 people today in the ER and 10 of them were positive, that's a 10% positivity rate. And right, it's going to vary depending on where you are. In an ER, it's going to be not 10%, it's going to be 30%, right? Because for some reason you came to the ER, so you're going to be sicker. Versus if you go to the fast track urgent care to get a test to go travel to visit grandma, that's going to be a really low positivity because those people probably aren't sick; they're asymptomatic. So you'd be really surprised if their numbers were super high. But you take all those numbers together and you put them to the county, and the county kind of mixes them all up in a bag and tells you what the overall county positivity rate is. And we would like that number to stay less than 5%, because less than 5%, I can enact some reasonable public health measures. But once you get past that, then, kind of everybody's a contact, and it gets, it's kind of everywhere. So you're not really doing containment anymore. You're sort of, you're surging essentially, or you're getting very high. And so it's kind of hard to contain virus.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to understand. Where are we with our knowledge of if you have had the virus, what are your chances of getting it again? Are you immune for a certain period of time? Are you immune indefinitely? Where's our understanding with that? Basically building up the antibodies and how effective that is.
Yeah, great question. So there's sort of three things that answer to that question. So first of all, it seems to be exceedingly rare to get reinfected with virus. As a matter of fact, public health officials are watching this pretty closely, and there is probably about 30 definitively documented cases of a reinfection. And they know this because, people who have symptoms for a long time end up getting tested multiple times, and, so you can kind of track the
30,
virus.
30, that's it, 30.
In the world, internationally, in the world, globally. It's a pretty small number. And the way you confirm this is by doing a genetic test of the virus after a period of time when it would be considered a reinfection versus a persistent positive test from the first infection. Right. So we know that people who get infected with virus may have a long time period where they stay positive, but eventually they'll clear that and they'll have negative tests. Now, or just by time, we'll consider it to have been enough and symptoms that they've been negative. Now they test again and they're symptomatic, and that retest for those patients, they've been sequenced. Those genetic that virus has been sequenced, and it looks a little tiny bit different than the first infection. And so public health experts are to say this is a definitive reinfection. So exceedingly rare. Now, the second part of this question gets into antibodies, and do we mount antibodies against the virus? Well, after 10 days of infection, about 99% of people are going to mount some IgG antibodies, and that's good. That's a good thing. They're going to mount some. Now, how much they amount, whether what we call neutralizing antibodies or not, that's a different question. Neutralizing antibodies, those antibodies actually attack the virus. And so that's what you want to have. You want to have neutralizing antibodies. Now, we kind of get in the weeds of this debate, and some people would argue we're too in the weeds because here's what happens is once you have some antibody, there's a whole nother part of your immune system that kind of just looks at the antibody and says, oh, got it. That's the computer code you're running. I'm going to build my own version of attack systems over here based on that computer code, and we'll be ready to roll anytime. And so I don't see that when I measure antibody. That's called T cell immunity. Antibodies are B cell immunity. There's a whole nother system called T cell immunity. It's like having the Army and the Air Force. And so the Air Force goes and builds the jets that don't look anything like the Army's tanks, but they recognize, oh, the Army's building tanks. I better get building here. And so there's a whole nother system that's building defense mechanisms. So it probably doesn't matter too much how much antibody you have or if it is neutralized or not. But having said that, the third part of this answer is that since we don't fully know, as we talked about earlier in this program, all the impacts downstream of the virus and what the virus is capable of and how much your antibodies work, there's still going to be a recommendation that people who've had the virus, even if they have antibody, should be vaccinated. Right. And I get that question a lot is, can I get the vaccine if I've had the COVID virus already? And the answer is going to be yes. Now, I don't know exactly when you're going to be eligible based on your risk factors and everything. But for example, if you were a frontline healthcare worker and you had a previous episode of COVID, you could certainly go and get vaccine in 2 or 3 weeks from now.
That's good to know. You had started to touch on at the beginning of the podcast. We're talking with Dr. Jason Wilson with Tampa General Hospital. You started to touch on it, the safety of the vaccine. Okay, so one of the things that we've been reporting and it's certainly putting out in our newscast is that Moderna, Pfizer, their vaccines have reported to be over 90% effective. Well, what does that really mean, though? And I think that's something we owe the viewers. What does that mean when it becomes distributable or when it is being distributed? Because you talked about that, yeah. You started to touch on that this is potentially could be a very safe vaccine to take. So I'll give you the floor and you can expound on that as much as you want to.
Okay. So first of all, I want people to recognize that this is a moon landing level of scientific breakthrough. It's a little overshadowed because we're in the middle of a pandemic, okay? But if things weren't so grim right now, this would be a really exciting.
We would be celebrating this.
Absolutely, because
something like this has never been done before. When you talk about what we're able to do for the cells and everything,
virus, from research vaccine to bedside vaccine in 6 or 7 months is incredible. And doing it with a technology that people have been studying for about 15 years now in the cancer space, they're rapidly accelerating that research and development just, because of all the attention and money being put into it. This is a moon landing level of scientific breakthrough. And what's very exciting about this type of a breakthrough is an mRNA vaccine could be a vaccine game changer for the future. It's essentially, you could just take the mRNA piece and sort of change out the code and you're ready for the next virus. So it's kind of like getting a new app on the phone or a firmware update. It may be very simple to kind of change those out. So this may be a game changer for vaccines in the future as well. Now, about the vaccine itself, a couple of important things. First of all, I think it's important for people in transparency to recognize that I have not seen a published clinical trial. You have not seen a published clinical trial. No one, the only people who've seen any actual raw data right now is the body of experts at the FDA, outside of the companies, of course. But the external people are the body of experts at the FDA. Those are the only people who've seen actual raw data. So we should keep that in mind as we talk through this. That's just something. Now, having said that, December 10th, we are going to see a technical report come out from the FDA. And that technical report will, through external experts, go through the data they've been presented with. And I think there's a lot of reasons to trust what those experts say and tell us about that data in that report. And so as long as that report looks like what the companies are telling us, then we're in good shape. So I just want to put that out there. We've got to make sure the report matches what we've been told so far. Now, we do have some published data about these type of vaccines. There's a very important safety study, a phase 2 safety study published in the England Journal of Medicine. BioNTech is the company that actually makes the mRNA and studies these mRNA vaccines. That's who Pfizer used for their vaccine. And they published a really important safety study that basically says, look, we can give people this specific mRNA protein sequence, a genetic sequence, make some protein, nothing bad happens. This is okay. And that's good because it led to the phase 3 studies. And phase 3 studies where we actually give people a vaccine and see if it's effective, make sure it causes less COVID, and while also not causing any safety problems. And so Moderna and Pfizer are both in active right now, still phase 3 clinical trials, as are a bunch of other companies. Here locally, Johnson & Johnson at the VA, here at USFTGH, Novavax. So lots and lots of other places are competing for other vaccines, which is great. We're going to need more than 2 companies to vaccinate the world. So that's fine. There's going to be different niches for different vaccines, and we need lots and lots of people competing and making vaccine. That's a good thing. That's okay. And we're going to see research continue in that space. That's fine. But Pfizer and Moderna, what happens in a clinical trial is there's a data safety monitoring board. And they, before the study even starts, say, okay, we are going to want to look at some data when you're about halfway through the trial, when you get X number of patients enrolled. We want to see what you got. And so when Pfizer hit that mark, they gave their data over to this data safety monitoring board. And the data safety monitoring board said, this looks pretty good. Nothing bad's happening here. And then Pfizer kind of looked at the numbers. They said, yeah, this does look pretty good. And what does looks pretty good mean? So I think that's really important for people to understand. So what looks pretty good means is basically people came into the study, they either got a placebo vaccine, meaning the vaccine didn't do anything, or they got the actual mRNA vaccine. Now, here's one thing that's a little funny about the study, or what we know so far about the study anyway, is that the patients weren't tested for COVID every day. Instead, they kind of, existed in their normal lives. And if they got sick, they told the research team they were not feeling great. And then the research team tested them for COVID. So this is really symptomatic COVID, right? Because maybe they had COVID and didn't know it. And, whether that's important or not, it's a different story. And maybe it prevented COVID that we didn't know, but that's not what we know so far. The data we're hearing on TV right now is data about patients who got sick and got tested for COVID and whether they had COVID
Therefore,
or not.
they showed symptoms. So that's why we have some things that are up in the air about the asymptomatic.
Correct. That's exactly correct, which is why we need to still wear masks.
Yeah.
Okay, so now what does this data mean? So pretty cool data so we've heard so far. And again, we want to make sure that the technical report looks the same and the published report looks the same. But here's what we've got so far. About 40,000 people in this big Pfizer study. Nothing really bad happens to them, first of all. That's a do no harm first, right? No gigantically scary bad events. Good. That's great. Now, moving past that, about 100 people, I'm just going to use some easy numbers here, about 100 people got COVID. But of those 100 people who were symptomatic and got tested and had positive COVID, about 90 to 95 of those people were in the placebo arm. And in the vaccine arm, only about 5 of those people were in the vaccine arm. So that's where you get that number, right? 90 to 95% effective. Okay. Now, what's even cooler is that of the people who got COVID, those 95 people who got COVID, about 10 to 15 of those people got really sick. They needed like ICU level care, intubation, big healthcare. None of those 15 people were in the vaccine arm. 0. So all those people got placebo. So the vaccine seems to protect against the seriousness and severity of COVID. That seems to be pretty clear. And what's kind of cool is that the Moderna study basically looks exactly the same. So again, about 100 people get COVID, but most, like 90, 95 of those people are in the placebo arm. Only 5 people or so are in the vaccine arm. And of the 10 or 15 people who got very, very sick, again, the Moderna study, about 10 or 15 people get very sick. They are all in the placebo arm. None of those people are in the vaccine arm.
It's another, it's an anecdotal case, right?
Yeah. Well, we always like it when, I always kind of make the joke to drug companies, or pharmaceutical reps that I always trust their data when a competing company gets the same result using their drug, right?
Right.
Like the same, because then, it's not quite pharmaceutical spin, right? It's actual reality. And so I think it's promising to hear that two competing companies basically got the same results in terms of the severity of illness, and especially this idea that the really sick patients, they got placebo and none of the sick patients really got the vaccine.
It's a good sign. It's a good sign.
That's a very, very promising sign.
That's good.
So again, we got to wait for the technical report. This is all hope on what we've heard so far. They both have moved forward with an emergency use authorization application, so they feel confident, obviously, in this data. And then these, they're about a week off from each other. So you'll see the first technical report come out for the Pfizer vaccine, and then you'll see a technical report come out for the Moderna vaccine. Now, of course, Europe's a little ahead of us, right? Their body and the UK has already reviewed some of this and allowed for authorization. I think beginning as we're speaking right now, we're probably seeing some vaccines happening today for the first time.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually. I think that actually just went through this morning. Okay, let's end with this timeline for it. That's all. You just basically gave me, that was vaccine 101 right there, Dr. Wilson. So thank you for that. I feel like I just took a class. But that's all right. I'm glad I know it, and I'm glad our viewers, if they choose to, can listen through it and know it as well. Timeline, realistic timeline. You're going to have distribution done in waves, I'm sure. How does this whole roll out? In your mind, just as best you can, how's this going to happen here specifically?
Yeah. So the Operation Warp Speed with the federal government has been going on since maybe March, April, May, somewhere around there. And it's been that part has been a really well done effort, fairly independent of the rest of the federal government and pharmaceutical companies, and has allowed operationalization between big distributors and these pharmacy organization companies. And so what you've seen already is manufacturing of these vaccines with the hope that they'll be approved, and then first a test run and now actual movement of the vaccines. And I believe I heard yesterday even movement all the way down to the distribution centers. So there is millions and millions of doses. I think there's 20 million doses sitting right now at distribution centers all around the country, ready to go to the sites. And in Florida, we have 5 sites approved, Tampa General being one of those sites, for vaccine to go from distribution center to site for frontline delivery. So we would expect, this is not, right, this is, movement from somewhere probably, some DOH office or CDC area, either in Atlanta or, in Florida. So it's not going to be hard to move that vaccine now to the site. Of course, these vaccines are only going to a few places because they require some very special properties to keep some technology to keep the vaccine properties intact. So negative 80-degree temperatures, dry ice transportation, and then also delivery to sites that can actually get the vaccine out to a large part of the community, like Tampa General. So you're going to see it go to about 5 sites, and it'll go there very quickly. So if on December 10th we see a technical report that looks favorable, you'll see a vote from the FDA to approve the emergency use authorization. If the emergency use authorization is approved, I don't have the calendar in front of me, but I think December 10th is next Thursday. And so you're kind of coming in the weekend, but you start to imagine that vaccine starts to move over the Friday and the weekend to the distribution sites, which would mean that next week, middle of December, 14th, 15th or so, you would expect to start seeing live, vaccination programs going live, vaccination programs going live. And who's going to get vaccine? Well, we get more and more information about that every day. We've had some calls to the CDC. The governor of Florida, Governor DeSantis, gave a talk yesterday. I think that matches what the CDC is saying, but there'll be a few waves. We certainly will target long-term care facility residents, frontline healthcare workers. But then even in that first, it's kind of 1A, 1B, 1C, that first one wave, even people who are other types of frontline workers outside of healthcare, law enforcement officers, EMS, teachers even, I think were on that list. So trying to get this out to the people who are seeing lots and lots of people in our community at one time. I think you're going to see pretty rapid distribution of that. Now, the other thing we want to do is, make sure people feel comfortable taking the vaccine. And so we got to, talk about these mRNA safety issues, which I think are very important. And it does seem to be a very safe vaccine so far. and recognize as we're distributing this vaccine, there's another vaccine we also need to get, and it does not exclude you from getting the COVID vaccine, and that's the flu vaccine. Florida yesterday was dead last in the state in the country, dead last in the country for flu vaccination.
I don't get that.
That's a troubling statistic.
In a year like this, I don't understand. I mean, personally, I got my flu vaccine back in September. I just thought it was the smartest thing to do. I wanted to try and rule out any kind of any symptoms I might have, given the work I do and the importance of the rest of my company and everything else. So that is shocking. To hear that Florida's dead last. That really surprised.
And what I would ask is, fortunately, the flu wave has not gotten here yet, so there is still time. So I would please ask that people go out and get their flu vaccine right now. It does not exclude you from getting a COVID vaccine. You get your COVID vaccine probably about 2 weeks after your flu vaccine, but you would still get a COVID vaccine. So and having a COVID vaccine does not protect you from the flu. So, to help your hospital systems, those things we talked about earlier, how do we provide supportive care to people and keep the case fatality rate low? Well, we can't have a surge of flu cases, at the same time we're having a surge of COVID cases. We can't have a twin-demic in medicine at the same time. So one of the best things the public can do right now is get that flu vaccine, and then in preparation for the fact that within the next couple of months, most of us will be offered a COVID vaccine as well.
Do you see this as something employers would get and then offer to employees at certain companies and have like a distribution like that? To make it even easier than you making a doctor's appointment and having to go in and schedule that out.
Are you talking about for the flu or for the COVID vaccine?
Well, that is offered in many places for the flu. I was talking more specifically about the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, this first wave of COVID vaccine is a little difficult for the employer just because it's technologically difficult to store and administer the vaccine, meaning it's negative 80 degrees, and you're also giving two doses, so it needs to be some medical record keeping that goes into, getting that patient back in.
It is 2 doses.
How
far apart?
About 28 days. Okay. Yeah, so you're going to get some immunity off that first dose, but to get the full immunity effect, you'll come back in for the second dose. And I don't know how much immunity in the first dose versus the second. Old vaccines, like the hepatitis A vaccine, I can tell you, from that first dose, you get like 95% immunity just from the first dose. And you're going to get like another 5% from the second. This might be 50-50. It might be 80-20. I don't know the answer to that yet. But it is a 2-dose vaccine. So given the sort of limitations of how much vaccine we have, kind of that supply line issue, the logistical storage issue, the 2-dose issue, you'll probably see concentrated sites being the ones that distribute vaccine. Now, there are discussions going on already for how to get this vaccine to employers of organizations that we know that all those employees need it, and they're frontline healthcare workers or some type of like the police department or the fire rescue guys, right? How do we want to get it to them? Now they've got some medical stuff, they've got some physician oversight. Does a hospital want to give it to them? Do they want to set up a separate site? Does DOH want to be involved? Those kind of conversations are going on in the community right now.
It's great information. He's Dr. Jason Wilson, Medical Director of the Clinical Decision Unit, Tampa General Hospital. He's gracious with his time with me here for almost an hour. I'm going to leave all this in. This is a really important podcast we're doing. We're just chock full of information and questions that I had, and maybe it's questions you had as the viewer and listener out there. Dr. Wilson, I cannot thank you enough for making some time for us. Is there anything else you'd like to add we didn't touch on? I'll give you the spotlight.
Well, you're going to hear the same old thing you've heard many, many times before, but it's so important to say again. Masks help. Please wear a mask. It's amazing how much of a difference we see when areas wear masks and the number of patients who get this virus. So if you want to prevent this virus, please wear a mask. Please wash your hands. Please continue to socially distance when possible. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Again, I understand the importance of social distancing, but as far as 2020 words go, Dr. Wilson, I can't wait till we don't have to say that one again.
I think 2020 is going to be a word we're just not going to ever want to hear
again. All right, we're weathering the storm, doing the best we can. So thank you so much for being on the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast. New episodes of the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast come out every single Wednesday morning. We're proud to bring it to you ad-free. You can check it out anywhere you get podcasts, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, it's there. You can also watch a video version on my Facebook page. Just look me up, James Tully, the blue check mark, that's me. Also, you can watch a video version on the ABC Action News streaming news channel. Download that on whatever streaming device you're using, and you can find The Shelf and watch the podcast there.